There you go. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here at the 2025 Jewish Book Festival. See a lot of repeat attenders here, which is great. It's a big week of books for us. And I know that when we originally planned the time and schedule for the book festival this year, we thought February would be a great time because it'll be cold and you'll want to cozy up with a good book. And today is proving that to be very true. Very true. My name is Jack Reitz. I'm the Director of Engagement with Jewish for Good at the 11JCC. Our book festival this year, as with years past, is a collaborative effort with Jewish for Good, Kehillah Synagogue, Judea Reform Congregation, and Bethel Synagogue. So we are grateful to see participants from all across the triangle here for this event today. I want to make one quick plug before we dive in, and Cheryl's going to be doing the introduction today. But I do want to say to everyone, if you like the book festival, you also might like the food festival, which is coming up in less than a month. The Jewish Food Festival is March 6th. You do have to buy tickets in advance, so I'll put a link to
Yeah,
that.
I think
Yes,
it's March 9th.
thank you. I get my nines and my sixes confused a little bit. Yeah, March 6th is a Thursday. It's March 9th. Thanks, Michelle. Um, yep, Sunday, March 9th, in less than a month. So get your tickets now before they sell out. It's going to be a great time for that. And the book festival will be going all week. I'll share some more about that at the end. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Cheryl McCartney, a member of our book festival committee, to get us rolling.
All right. Well, I'm so glad to see such a nice turnout. And for those of you who are willing, do let our speaker see you. Obviously, there's no requirement that you do that, but we would like it if you would. Today, we have Robin Judd, who is going to speak about the book Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. And Robin Judd is a professor of history at The Ohio State University. At OSU, she directs the Hoffman Leaders and Leadership in History Fellowship Program. Herself, a child and grandchild of Holocaust survivors, Robin serves on the state of Ohio's Commission for Holocaust and Genocide Education and Memorialization. She is immediate past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, which is the largest international society for scholars interested in Jewish studies. So far, she has authored 2 books. Her first was Contested Rituals, Circumcision, Kosher Butchering, and the Making of German Jewish Political Life. And this is her second book, Between Two Worlds, I Told You, Jewish War Brides. And this book received 2 National Jewish Book Awards and was named a finalist for the Ohioana Book Award. So please, without further ado, Robin, you take the floor.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Yes? Perfect. I'm going to share my screen and we are going to look at a couple of slides for a bit, and then at around 30 minutes or so, I will hand the floor back over to Cheryl for your Q&A. So as Cheryl indicated earlier, I'm going to be talking about my book, Between Two Worlds, Jewish War Brides After the Holocaust. And today what I'd like to do is sort of 3 things. First, give you a little bit of an introduction and a background about the book. I want to talk about why studying, talking about, reading about Jewish war brides is an important task for those of us who are interested in the history of the Holocaust or the history of American Jews or Canadian Jews or British Jews. And then I'm going to look at 2 couples. So we'll look at Floria and Harry, Sala and Abe, and we'll talk a little bit about them. I should say that I speak somewhat quickly. And so if at any point you need me to slow down, you can hop on and tell me that you need me to slow down, and I'll do my best to do so. So a war bride refers to a civilian who marries a member of a military personnel who's serving abroad. And there's a very long history of war brides more generally. Look, even if we think about the Jewish tradition, we have several mentions in the Bible about what to do when someone takes a bride in war. So the concept of a war bride is not a contemporary one. There is a very long history of war brides more generally. And in the American and Canadian context, we begin to see the first peak in numbers of war brides more generally during the First World War. And it's in World War I that the Canadian government establishes a relatively clear policy around what should happen if a Canadian soldier serving abroad wishes to marry a civilian. The British government had a much longer history of that. Their actually legal code around this concept dates back to the medieval and early modern periods. And in the American context, we have an evolving group of policies around the war bride. But during the Second World War, we have hundreds of thousands of civilians who marry military personnel. Almost all of these are non-Jewish women. Most of them are Protestant. The largest number of war brides coming to the US, Canada, and Canada come from Britain. The second largest number that come to Britain are from Australia. And among all of these, there are a few thousand Jewish war brides who originate in North Africa and in Europe. And I sort of came to my interest in Jewish war brides in two different ways. The first has to do with this image for what's me, the far left corner, where you can see an Americanization class taking place. And you might see this woman here in the fabulous sweater and necklace, who I think looks a little bit like me, or perhaps I look a little bit like her. And that was my grandmother. I always knew of the existence of Jewish war brides because my grandmother was a Jewish war bride. But as she often would describe it, her experience was unique. She did not know any other Jewish war brides. And my grandmother, like many Holocaust survivors, did not want to talk about her experiences in the Holocaust or even her immigration to the United States. She would sort of talk about her years up to about 1942 and the birth of my father. And then she'd pick up again at around 1950 with my father as an 8-year-old living in Yonkers. And so I had always sort of put the Jewish war bride story to the side. And then in the kind of early 2000s, I began teaching the history of the Holocaust at The Ohio State University. And I really wanted to teach that course differently than had been taught when I was a graduate student or even when I was a college student. And I tried to incorporate a number of memoirs that were written by women. And one of the things that struck me as I started to read memoirs written by women survivors, and particularly the early memoirs that were published, was how many of them ended with them meeting the men that they were going to marry. So Gerda Weissman Klein is probably the best known American female survivor memoir, All But My Life. Leisha Rose was the first survivor in Canada to publish her memoir, The Tulips Are Red. Gina Turgell published hers, I Light a Candle, in Britain. And I include two other examples that I also use in my classes, Seed of Sarah by Judith Magyar Isaacson and Lala's story by Lala Fishman. I also include here the kind of a snapshot of the episode from This Is Your Life, the television show, when they first introduced a Holocaust survivor to an American audience. And the first survivor that they introduced was a woman by the name of Hannah Kohner, who herself was a war bride. So why then, once I started reading about these war brides, did I think it was time to start talking about Jewish war brides? Well, the more I read and the more I did research, I learned that Jewish war brides really tell us something about the of survival in the aftermath of trauma. Very often, when we think about the kind of immediate post-Holocaust period, we talk about liberation in a pretty triumphalist way, and the Jewish war brides threw into relief the problems of survival. The second thing that I sort of made argued as we worked on this topic was that the Jewish war brides tell us a lot about kind of unevenness and the unhappiness of reconstruction and recovery. The war brides, as I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, teach us a lot about the many post-war communities and the senses of unbelonging that war brides and their spouses might have. And the war brides sort of get us to think about issues concerning things like marriage, immigration, and citizenship. And so when thinking about how to tell this story, it occurred to me that I wanted to kind of frame my book around 5 moments. The first being liberation. So what was liberation like for these men and women? And I should say, as an aside, that one could be a male war bride, and there were Jewish male war brides. The second was encounter. How is it that someone like Isaac Rose, whose image we have here, he was a Jewish chaplain, a Canadian Jewish chaplain who marries Leisha, who becomes Leisha Rose. How is it that they meet one another? Third, what is their courtship and marriage like? Fourth, how do they immigrate? Because as we'll kind of talk about a little bit today, and maybe we'll go into more in the Q&A, the war brides were guaranteed immigration to the US, Britain, and Canada. That by December of 1945, all 3 countries had created a category that circumvented existing immigration legislation, which meant that if you were a war bride, it was very easy to come to the US, Britain, or Canada. And I put that in quotes because in the book, I also talk about those cases where it's actually not so easy and they're denied access to coming to the US, Britain, or Canada. And then last but not least, I was really curious about their early years. What was it like for them when they acculturated, when they came to Toronto or to Durham or to New York or to London or to Manchester? The way I wanted to frame the book as well was to sort of ground each chapter in a few sort of stories or a few couples. And some of that was because I wanted to write a book that was accessible. My first book, which I loved writing, was a much more academic book. And I wanted to write a book that was going to be accessible to academics, that would be meaningful to academics, but also a book that someone might walk into a bookstore and read, or you might go to the JCC and hopefully see my book in a pile of books and think, wow, I'd like to read this and purchase it. And so for me, that the thinking about stories was going to be really important. I knew that I was not going to be able to talk about the hundreds upon hundreds of couples that I had discovered, and instead that I would want to ground every chapter in a few stories, and that I would want to choose couples whose experiences were significantly different enough that I'd be able to use them as ways of showcasing both similarities and differences. And so today I'm just pulling out two couples, and they're the couples that begin the first chapter of my book. And that's Flory and Harry Jagoda, who we see right here, and Sala and Abe Bonder, who we see right here. Now, when I talk about liberation, part of what I do in that first chapter is illuminate the ways in which some people experience liberation much earlier than others. And I guess conversely, we could say some people experience liberation much later than others. So Flory Cabillo Jagoda was born in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, but spends much of her childhood and her early teens in Zagreb. When the Nazis and their allies invade Yugoslavia, she and her mother and stepfather move to Split. They go to the coast of Yugoslavia because they don't want to be under German occupation, but under Italian occupation. And they're hoping that in Split, they won't have some of the anti-Jewish laws and policies that were being enacted in areas where the Germans had occupied. They will be quite dismayed when they arrive in Split and find that indeed the Italians implemented a whole host of anti-Jewish laws and policies, and indeed they and others are deported from Split to a internment camp in the island of Corsola. And it's on the island of Corsola where Flory remains with her mother and stepfather for over a year and is eventually liberated, and I put that in quotes, by a group of British fighters and partisans who, in advance of the German occupation, bring a group of Jews, mostly women and children, to Bari, which at that point was under British control. And I sort of hesitated because there was still a fair bit of fighting around Bari. And so while Bari itself was under British control, there were large areas around the airfield surrounding Bari that were not yet under British control. She, Flory, I should say, when finds herself in Bari, she speaks almost no Italian. She had learned a little bit of it when she was in the internment camp in Corsola. She had several languages. She had Serbian, she had Serbian Croatian, she spoke Ladino at home, but she has some French, but again, she's not a Yiddish speaker, and that will be important for later. And she's certainly not an English speaker. Sala Solarts is in her about to be deported to her sixth camp around the same time that Flory experiences her liberation. Sala is born in the small Hasidic sort of town of Serac when the Nazis invade Germany in September of 1939. She and her family go to Warsaw, hoping that they will be able to stay with family. They and many other Jews find their way into Warsaw in that 1939 moment. And within a year, they will be interned in the Warsaw Ghetto. She is then deported to the ghetto in Lublin. From Lublin, she is deported to Majdanek. From Majdanek, she's deported to Auschwitz. From Auschwitz to Ravensbrück. And then from there, she's eventually deported to Tachau, where towards the end of the war, she is forced on a death march, and she is liberated by Russian forces in the town of Oschatz, which is a town that is outside of the city of Dresden. I was sort of fascinated by how couples might have just met one another. I sort of alluded earlier that Flori barely has any Italian and certainly doesn't have English. Sala had some Polish and Yiddish. She did not speak much German, and certainly didn't have English or French or Italian. And one of the things that really struck me as I began to do the research, and I'm happy to talk about the kinds of sources I used or how I found these stories. But one of the things that struck me was how very important it was when our couples talk about encounter, how they met one another, and when they talked about courtship, how they kind of dated one another, that they often put kind of Jewish places on the map. And by that, I mean that encounter tended to take place, which makes sense, where these Jewish victims were. So in the camps, it took place in Zionist youth circles. It took place in the during Jewish holidays. And in fact, Salah and Abe meet one another in Rosh Hashanah when Abe goes to the displaced persons camp in Hanover in northern Germany, and he sees Salah sort of sitting to the side and speaks to her in Yiddish. And that's what sort of begins their encounter. Interestingly, Flori and Harry also have a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur story, but theirs is quite different. Harry couldn't communicate with Flori. He spoke with her through his translator. He asked her if she was interested in attending a dance. She said no, that her parents would not allow for her to spend time with British or American soldiers. And so he offers to ask her parents' permission. And it's when he goes to their apartment that he sees a machzor, the Jewish prayer book for the holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, on the counter, and then says in sort of a mix of Hebrew and Yiddish and Ladino, he says, Hebreu, are you Jewish? And that then leads them to sort of discovering that both of them are Jewish. Her parents, by the way, do give permission for her to attend the dance, but only if they serve as chaperones. And indeed, they chaperoned many of the dates that Flori and Harry had. So that maybe then turns to the question of courtship and marriage. Uh, it One of the things that I talk about in the book is the very sort of Jewish spaces where many of these couples have their courtship, and some of that is the reality of where these individuals are. They'll be at the DP camps. They are going to the military synagogue centers. They're often taking part in kind of Jewish refugee sites in Hachshara or Zionist circles. And I find that the courtships often were pretty fast. There's sort of a reality that many of these military personnel are going to be transferred or demobilized. And so very often they'll begin to petition for marriage relatively quickly. But marriage isn't necessarily a slam dunk. That the Allies, as early as 1943, begin to kind of legislate how it is that couples will be able to marry when they serve abroad. And the marriage policies have a lot to do with time and place, and I'm happy to go into the details when we go into the Q&A. But suffice it to say that someone like Flori, who is in Italy, has no difficulty being approved for marriage to Harry when he petitions. And when he petitions, she's interviewed by his chaplain. There's a whole host of papers that they need to submit. She has to go through a medical exam, but she's approved. In the case of Salah and Abe, she's not approved. The Canadians in September of 1945 prohibited their soldiers from marrying anyone on the kind of the occupied German soil, even if they were themselves victims of the Nazi past. Part of the reason why our allies care so much about marriage and vetting the spouses has to do with this piece. And that is that spouses, and in the case of the US and Britain, fiancés are allowed to circumvent existing immigration legislation. And not only that, but if the couples so choose, in the case of Canada and the US, the governments, alongside the Red Cross, will orchestrate and organize the travel that is required for immigration. And so war brides, if they so chose, and about, I would say, 3/4, if not more, of the war bride couples choose to take part in this coordinated immigration, that they first, once they receive their paperwork and after marriage, then or in the case of the Fiancé Acts, which is passed in 1946 after betrothal, and the military personnel would file the paperwork for immigration. Once the war bride or war fiancé receives their paperwork, they are first mandated to appear at a war bride processing center. There were large and small processing centers. Flory went to a small one in Naples, but there were also very large ones in Bremerhaven, in France, and in England. And it would be at these processing centers that the paperwork would be cleared. There would be another medical test. Sometimes it would take a couple of days, maybe even a week or two. And these, in the case of these larger processing centers, they were almost like bases. Some of them were so large that there were movie theaters and grocery stores. And that's because we also had Army personnel that were being returned home. We have other immigrants who are also migrating to the US, Canada, and Britain. But in all of these cases, the war brides are separate. And one of the things that really struck me about this moment of being in the war bride detention or processing center and then traveling by ship was that very often these women, and to some degree men, had more in common with the DPs, let's say, the Jewish DPs who might be traveling to the US, Britain, or Canada, than with the war brides themselves. And then for the last slide, and then I appreciate we're kind of approaching that time that will open up for Q&A. I was really interested in what it was like for these women and men once they moved, in this case, to Montreal, like Sala and Abe, or if they moved to Youngstown, Ohio, like Flory and Harry. Because first, as I alluded to earlier, many of these war brides did not have the languages of their spouses or of the families with whom they would be living. In many cases, the brides follow their military personnel, but in some cases, they immigrate before the military personnel are demobilized. So they may even move into the home of their spouse's family and not have the language at all. Gina Turgell, whom I mentioned earlier, who was the British Jewish survivor, she moves into this apartment and can't understand almost anything that's being spoken around her. And so the acculturation stories of these women could be really kind of prolonged and in some cases really painful. The wonderful sort of irony around Florrie and Harry's story is that Harry's family all spoke Yiddish and Florrie spoke Ladino. So I'm happy to talk about kind of the war bride settings and the Holocaust survivor settings in which these women sort of floated, perhaps in the Q&A. So I know I promised that I would talk for around 20 to 30 minutes, and I think I did just that.
Great.
Oh, you're muted,
we're gonna-
Cheryl.
Yeah,
yeah.
muted.
Oh, try one more time, Cheryl.
Hi. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, you can see that there's going to be a lot of questions because every single thing that was said has related items. But I'm going to start with the question about your experience, Robin. You and I discussed before that you would be willing to talk about it. And in the beginning, that first slide, you said, "This is my grandmother." And she was willing to talk to me up to 1940 something. And then she didn't include the years up to 1950 something. And I remember that as a precocious little girl, you asked about it. And your grandfather had very elegant ways of decoying you away from finding out. But ultimately, you did find out. And what I was thinking is that this encounter that your grandparents had was even different from some of the others because they, and I'll let you take over, talk about how they were aware of each other, shall we say. And go ahead and fill us in.
Sure, I'll happily fill you in, although I will push a plug to read the book and where I kind of go into detail of my family story. So as Cheryl pointed out, my grandfather could usually distract me with food. It worked then, it seems to still work now. And it was obvious to me that my grandparents felt real pain when talking about their pasts, and certainly one of the things that we learn when we work in oral history work, and in this book I did a number of interviews, and one of the major rules of doing oral histories is that you are not supposed to be causing the individual trauma, right? Like if somebody wants to stop, or if somebody doesn't want to share information, or if somebody shares information and says, I don't want that in the book, then you are obligated, right? Of course you're obligated to listen to the actors with whom you're engaging. And so even as a teenager, I understood that I could ask the question, but that if my grandmother did not want to answer me, that it was inappropriate to push her. And some of that had to do, I mean, not the inappropriate to push her, but some of her wariness had to do with uh the enormity of loss that my grandmother experienced in the war. So she and my father survived, but my biological grandfather died at liberation. My grandmother's siblings and their families, so their spouses and their children, were all murdered. My grandmother's parents and in-laws were, well, mother-in-law, her father-in-law had died before the war, but were all murdered by the Nazis. My grandmother emerged from the war with one second cousin that she found in 1945, and eventually she found like a second cousin once removed and a third cousin, but the family was wiped out, and that was so painful for my grandmother, and it remained always something that my grandmother, even though she didn't talk about the war, would talk about, her sisters. So when my sister and I would be throwing shoes at each other and giving one another black eyes, my grandmother would often sort of dissolve into tears and talk about how she and her sisters, loved each other and never fought with one another. And that if only my sister and I would understand how wonderful it was to have sisters, right? Like we should know how lucky we were. So it wasn't that we didn't know that my grandmother had been a survivor. It was that we understood that it was really painful for her. We also knew that there was a sort of unusual dynamic within my grandparents' story, in that the man that I knew as my grandfather, my grandmother's husband, the man who adopted my father, um, he was related to my grandmother's first husband. And that's how he was a refugee soldier. And a number of the military personnel that I talk about in the book were refugee soldiers. They were mostly men, but some women who had been born in the 20s and 30s, came to the US, Britain, or Canada in the 1930s, and enlisted, hoping often to come back to Europe, and hoping to find family members. And in the case of the people I knew as my grandparents, right? My grandfather, he was a refugee soldier. He served in Italy. At the end of the war, he was in Vienna. And from Vienna, he was able to go to Humana, which was his hometown, in Czechoslovakia, or at that point, it was Slovakia. And when he arrives at his family home, and he was able to get back to his family home in Humana, he finds two women and one child and one adolescent. So his sister survived, my Aunt Anna, and my grandmother, who had been married to one of his siblings, survived, as well as my father. And then my Aunt Anna, one of her two children, my cousin Gubby, he was a teenager at the time, and he had come back to Humana from Auschwitz. And so my grandfather sort of finds these two women, two children, or one child, one, 3.5-year-old, almost 4-year-old, and one 17-year-old, and desperately tries to figure out how to get them to come to the US. And as I talk about in the book and elsewhere, it was a known strategy to come to the US, to Britain or Canada as a war bride. And that's not my saying that all of these relationships were strategic, but rather it's to say that this was a known strategy. And so my grandfather first tries other routes to get my grandmother to have her have permission, but there's no one who can serve as her sponsor, because she has no siblings, and and none of her husband's family can count because her husband is no longer alive. And so eventually my grandfather marries my grandmother. He couldn't have married his sister. And one of his cousins marries my Aunt Anna. And that's how my Aunt Anna and my grandmother come to the US, as my father. So my father comes as a dependent of who will become my grandfather. He adopts my father. And Gubby refuses to come to the US at that point, and he goes to Palestine. He wants to, he was a Zionist. He doesn't want to live back with his mother. And so he goes to Palestine and remains in Palestine, then the state of Israel, until the 1960s or so. And then eventually he comes to the US. So that's sort of my family history. And that kind of element of it was, for my grandparents, an uncomfortable dynamic that they did not like to talk about. And we sort of understood as kids that was a dynamic we did not ask about. We didn't ask my grandmother, we didn't ask my grandfather, we didn't ask my father. And as I often say, it was really such an act of a generosity of spirit that my father was comfortable with my writing the conclusion to my book. Because as I told Cheryl, I sort of had two conclusions, one that had my family story in it, because I had to do research. I mean, I couldn't learn about that part of my grandmother's story from my grandmother. She refused to tell me, and she passed away many years ago. And my father was a child. He has no recollection. And so it was really only through doing historical research that I sort of learned about when my grandfather died and where he died and where my grandmother had been and where they got married and, all of that, which my father really wouldn't have known, and which my grandmother never really talked about.
Thank you so much for that detail. It really demonstrates a lot of the points actually that you were making. And among them, you taught me a new word, liminal. And I'll let you talk about that word a little bit later, but I do want other people to have a chance to ask questions. So let's open it up. I've got a whole stack of them, so if nobody has questions, I already know what I want to ask. But let's have you have a chance. Anybody?
And you can either write it in the chat or raise your hand or use the hand raise function, and we'll call on you.
Michelle, I saw you kind of gesture a little bit.
Called out.
Busted.
Actually,
Unmute yourself, girl. We want to hear you.
okay. I was actually wondering about like if there were any communities formed. I mean, I can just imagine how lost some of these war brides would feel as they come to this new country. And I wonder if like new communities formed around them and how that changed, sort of the culture of wherever they were living, the United States or Canada or wherever they were.
It's such a great question. And that's, in fact, I mean, it's as if you and Cheryl had communicated ahead of time, because that's where I tried not to use the word liminal too frequently in the book, but where kind of this liminality, this sort of in-betweenness plays out, because these women often were not considered to be part of the survivor community, at least at first. And later that changes. And I talk about that in the book too. But when they arrive, they're often seen as being sort of too healthy to look like survivors, or in some cases, too wealthy, or it was too easy for them to immigrate, or they were able to immigrate on the same ship as other survivors, but they were, 8 in a room instead of 14 in a room, right? So like there was a way in which they are kind of seen as not part of the survivor community. And there are real like nuanced war bride communities in several cities. Most of these are not Jewish war bride communities. Some of them are founded as early as the First World War. So during the Second World War, some of these clubs begin working right away to help integrate war brides. And so New York City is sort of the best example, because and some of you may even know of the Cosmopolitan Club in New York, a very well-known women's club that began as a war brides club for British war brides during the First World War, right? And they have all kinds of programming for first British war brides during the Second World War, but then other war brides, because they understand that war brides may need to learn English, they may need to learn cooking, you name it. So the Jewish war brides are sometimes invited, right, or welcomed into those circles, but find that there are also differences there, that they may not, have the same languages, or in some cases that they may be on the ships with, German women war brides, who are not Jewish. And then there's the whole kind of question about perpetratordom. So there's like lots of ways in which, and that's where I talk about the problem of survival. There are lots of ways in which for these women and men, they find it incredibly difficult to find a community in those early years. And they're kind of bouncing among communities. And some of that has to do often, sometimes it's determined by their spouses or by their in-laws. Sometimes it has to do with their economic class. But very often they're kind of neither fish nor fowl. And one thing that I mentioned too in the book, that if you may be hearing the dogs getting very excited, I think this may be their favorite part, but um, one of the challenges that many of these women find, and here I'm being explicit about women, many of these female war brides find, is that uh, the expectation by many of the spouses and many of the chaplains is that when these Jewish war brides return, when they immigrate to Canada or the US or Britain, that the group that will help them uh, will be the sisterhoods of various synagogues. And many sisterhoods uh, make clear that they really begrudge and resent the existence of these women because they've been sending packages. They've been writing letters. Some of these new husbands are their former boyfriends, right? And so there are all these articles, in the Jewish newspapers about the girls left behind. The National Sisterhood Association of the Reform Movement devotes much of a day in 1945 to what they called the so-called hasty marriages, and what is their responsibility towards them. So these war brides kind of become touchstones, even though they're few in number, they kind of become part of the fabric. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
That's
and it was
really, really
one,
interesting.
yeah, good question. Who else has something they want to comment or question? All right, then I've got another one, which is, as I mentioned, this book has won 2 Jewish Book Awards, and one of them is in writing based on archival material. And if you start to think about how did this come together, you begin to appreciate what it took for Robin Judd to amass this database. And I will mention that I watched a couple of YouTube videos of her talks, and it became clear that there were people in the audience who were bursting to tell her stuff. But she started with amassing a lot of material that wouldn't be considered traditional that you would find in an academic library. So I'm laying the groundwork for her to talk about the clever and confusing and challenging way that she got all this.
Thank you for the question. And uh, winning the 2 Jewish Book Awards side by side was such an incredible experience because the because one of the awards was in writing about Jewish women, the Women's Studies Award, and that uh, often is awarded to somebody whose book is in a popular or crossover genre, and the other was in kind of archival research, on which this book is really based. And so this book was a great second book. It would have been a terrible first book for those of you who are in the world of academia. There was no way I could have researched and written this book in time to have gotten tenure. This book took me to, six or seven countries. It required 5 different languages. I did research in a wide number of archives, but also did oral interviews of individuals. I took out classifieds in a number of popular Jewish newspapers. and in the Jewish War Veterans magazine, asking if people had materials or if they were willing to talk with me. And I heard from a large number of people through those classifieds. I worked with the chaplaincy materials. As I alluded to earlier, there was a vetting process for the marriages, and that meant that the chaplains were almost always the ones who were charged with making the determination of whether or not a marriage could go ahead. And Jewish chaplains had an additional responsibility for paperwork because the Jewish chaplains were funded, or their funding was supplemented by national Jewish organizations in Britain, in the US, and in Canada. And so the chaplains were required both to submit paperwork to their command, but they also, in like the case of the US, would send it to the National Jewish Welfare Board. And CANRA was the subgroup under this National Jewish Welfare Board. And that was supposed to be specifically about kind of the Jewish work that they were doing. So there was a lot of material there about these couples. And then I also spent a lot of time with wedding announcements. I kind of made my way through Jewish newspapers in those 3 countries, looking for marriage announcements, wedding announcements, thinking that if, families then were anything like families later in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or 90s, that we might have a description of a couple that got married or a couple that was going to get married. And so there were lots of ways in which I sort of began with kind of trying to find people and then trying to find out more about those people.
And languages, lots of languages, right?
Yeah, lots of languages, and that also helped me, if you will, narrow the project. I don't look at the Jewish survivors who marry Soviet soldiers. I don't have Russian. And so I really only looked at those women who married American, British, Canadian, and sometimes kind of auxiliary, so free French, free Czech, etc. Because I would have those languages to be able to look through their materials.
Looks like
Okay,
Richard has a
Richard,
question
yeah.
first, and then we'll go
Do
back.
you want to unmute Richard and go ahead and ask your question?
My interest was in the children, the next generation. Did they have any sense of separateness from their contemporaries, or were they special kids, or were they just kids?
It's a wonderful question. So I think, they were children of survivors and they were children of veterans. And so in that sense, they grew up in homes that were imprinted with trauma, and were akin to other children of survivors, or other children of veterans. I think what we see with with many of these Jewish war brides is that many of them were not like my grandmother. I mean, there were many who were like her, but there were also many who were like Gerda Weissman Klein or Gina Turgell. And the first of the women to begin talking about their Holocaust experiences are war brides. And I kind of surmise that may be because they have access to English speaking communities, certain networks, certain circles that some of our survivor communities or some of our children of survivor communities are like a lag behind. So so the children, I think, are kind of unique, but they also share a lot of similarities with other children of survivors or other children of war veterans.
And just say a word or two, since we were talking about the people who were war brides or men who married military, the kind of trauma that they were joining with in their military spouse.
Yeah, that's something that really sat with me, that just as when we study the couples, the Holocaust survivors who marry one another, and that is a well-studied phenomenon, that Holocaust survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war tended to try to marry other Holocaust survivors, and that they have this sort of shared trauma, shared language of trauma. In this case, it's a different shared trauma. Like they've each experienced trauma, but the trauma is different, and how they envision the trauma is different, and how they think of the other is slightly different. And that's something that I wrestle with in the book, but also, has been the stuff of more academic articles. I'm writing one now on kind of emotion clusters in the testimonies and letters of the survivors and the military personnel, in terms of how they think about their origin stories. So yeah, I mean, it's a complicated shared trauma.
Now, one thing that occurs to me that Jane may be able to comment on is we've had a couple of interviews with novel writers who based their stories on real people. And it just strikes me that you have raised a lot of issues that were ripe for not only academic writing, but maybe some novels. So Jane, maybe you could comment.
I'm just thinking. Oh, yeah. I'm thinking about George, who the older man that I encountered, who was in a picture with my father during the war. He said repeatedly, "I don't want to talk about the past," and I didn't know about my father. I didn't know what my father had done or had not done. So I chose a novel because I could make it up.
Yeah.
I felt
That
good.
was fascinating to me. Yes.
Yeah, no, I have a good friend here in Columbus, Linda Cass, who is a novelist, and she says the same thing, that she's written a novel about her mother, who is a survivor, and a novel about her father, who is a Ritchie boy. And for her, that was the way of telling their story, was using the materials that she could find and then imagining it.
Mhm.
Um, and it's also why my story only appears in the conclusion, because while I found a lot of material, I did not find as much on my grandparents as I did on many of the other couples that I chose to focus on.
Well, this has just been so good. And
Thank
I wondered
you.
if you have any wrap-up remarks, if you want to advertise the paperback version, if you want to invite anybody to write to you who's got more stories. I don't know if you're still collecting data. Go ahead, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I am writing my email in the chat. If anyone does
The
have,
direct message, Robin. If you want.
oops, sorry. If anyone has any questions for me. But yes, I am so delighted that the press, it has just come out with the paperback version. And I don't know, Jack, if you have the paperback or the
We
hard
have the
copy
hardback version,
at
which
the JCC, which is lovely.
that's a great version too. You can still buy it.
It's
Just
a
because the
great, right.
paperback's out. That
The
hardback.
paperback is now out, and the audio version is coming out in April. So, and that will be available on Audible and other venues. So it's not, most of us in academia don't often think that we'll write a book. I mean, that will cross over, and I really wanted to. And and it's really kind of humbling to me, that it's gotten this kind of acclaim. So thank you. And thank you all for sharing and for asking your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are, Robin, again, thank you so much for all the time you've put into our festival. It's been great getting to talk to you over the last few weeks.
Thank you.
We're continuing throughout the week here. At 7 o'clock tonight, we've got Benjamin Cohen with The Einstein Effect. We are in person at the JCC on Friday morning for Adam Sosby's memoir, so please swing by for that. Fill out that post-festival survey. 2 people who fill it out will get a chance to pick a book of their choosing from the catalog of this year's festival. I think that's it. One more plug, sign up for that food festival as well, starting in less than a month on March 9th. And I'll see many of you tonight at 7 p.m. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
you.